Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, says the EU is considering ways to help break the deadlock over Brexit. He says he doesn't think the European Union would scrap the backstop, the plan to keep an open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But he said some European politicians were thinking very hard about where their red lines should be drawn. The UK is due to leave the EU on the 29th of March with or without a deal. Our political correspondent Chris Mason has the story.
Time is running out. Opponents of the Prime Minister's Brexit plan have their red lines, the things they're not willing to shift on, and so does the European Union. The Chancellor, attending a gathering of business and political leaders in Switzerland, said leaving without a deal would cause significant disruption, but he detects an appetite for at least some compromise.
What I hear from European politicians and commentators that I've talked to here in Davos is that there is a process going on of thinking very hard about where the European Union has drawn its red lines, whether they really need to be in the place where they have been drawn.
Lots of opponents of the current plan don't like the so-called backstop, the insurance policy designed to keep the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland open under any circumstances. Mr Hammond acknowledged the EU was unlikely to fundamentally change its position on this, a view made clear later by the Irish Prime Minister.
Why would we give up a legal guarantee and something that we know will work in practice for a promise to sort it out later?
MPs can't change the Brexit deal themselves, but the government hopes minds are moving here, and next week could prove that. If, in a series of votes on Tuesday, enough MPs were to support one idea, such as significant changes to the backstop, the Prime Minister could go to Brussels and say, if you give me that, I can get it through. Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party prop up Theresa May in government, and Mrs May needs to persuade them to back her plan. So, what do they want her to do?
Go back to Brussels to ask Brussels to deal with the backstop. There are many good elements of the withdrawal agreement. Let's keep those. But if we want a deal, if Europe wants a deal, then there has to be an agreement.
But the Prime Minister's still facing opposition on all sides of the House, including her own.
The only thing we were prepared to countenance is if you take the backstop out of the treaty, lock, stock and barrel.
I'm not quite sure that it's realistic to expect much change, but I've said throughout there needs to be flexibility on both sides.
And even if Parliament backs a deal, the time for getting the laws through to make Brexit happen is short. The government tonight still thinks it can be done, but is contemplating a short delay to Brexit if necessary.
We have a very strong relationship with our EU friends and neighbours, and I'm absolutely certain that if we needed a couple of extra weeks or something, that would be feasible.
Stepping into the melee without any specific reference to Brexit, the Queen, telling a branch of the Women's Institute about the importance of seeking out the common ground. As that clock continues to tick down, Brexit is due to happen 9 weeks tonight. Chris Mason, BBC News at Westminster.
The Chancellor has told ITV News the government cannot rule out a no-deal Brexit. Philip Hammond also refused to rule out resigning if the UK does leave the EU without an agreement. Our economics editor Joel Hills reports from the World Economic Forum in Davos.
That's it. It's all over at the World Economic Forum. Parting is never easy, as the Chancellor knows only too well. He believes that leaving the EU without a deal will cause Britain great harm, but no deal remains a possibility.
People at home, Chancellor, will be completely baffled. They know that you think now that no deal would be economically an act of self-harm and politically an act of betrayal, but you're still threatening to do it.
No, I'm not threatening to do it.
It's still on the table. You won't rule it out.
And so is no Brexit, because it's possible that Parliament could say we're not going to go ahead with this.
Are you committed to avoiding no deal?
I'm committed to getting a deal. That is the right way to avoid no deal.
Are you committed to avoiding no deal?
Yeah, I am.
Would you resign if necessary?
Look, I'm committed to delivering a deal as a member of the government. That is what the government is absolutely, unequivocally.
And would you stay in a government that took the UK out of the EU without a deal?
So the government isn't going to take the UK out without a deal. We are going to keep working to get a deal.
You're not ruling out resigning, Chancellor?
I'm not going to threaten to resign. I've never threatened to resign.
The Queen appears to be worried now. Is she right to be? Does the government have a plan? Does it know what it's doing?
Well, I think what the Queen has said is what we're all thinking, that there has to be a compromise here.
The Chancellor believes that as the clock ticks down, the EU's position on the Irish backstop in particular will shift. European politics has a track record of last-minute U-turns, and no deal would be a disaster for others too, not least Ireland. The Irish Prime Minister says he's committed to avoiding a hard border, but today admitted there's a risk of one returning if it all goes wrong.
It would involve customs posts, cameras, physical infrastructure, possibly, police presence or an army presence to back it up. The problem with that in the context of Irish politics and history is those things become targets.
Fresh mountain air is said to clear the mind, but no one has given any ground in Davos this week. The stakes are high, but it is not high noon just yet. There are still 9 weeks left to find common ground. Joel Hills, ITV News in Davos.
Let's go live to our political correspondent Libby Wiener in Westminster. And Libby, as we just heard Joel saying there, the clock, of course, is ticking. And tonight, a senior Conservative MP is suggesting that the EU could offer a short extension.
Yes, for all the talk today as to whether we're leaving with a deal or without a deal, one thing that the Prime Minister does always seem to have been pretty certain about is that we are leaving on March the 29th. But tonight, the plates appear to be shifting again. Andrea Leadsom, the leader of the House of Commons, has suggested that there could be a delay of perhaps 2 weeks or so to try and ensure that all the necessary legislation gets through Parliament. Now, there are 7 outstanding bills, so that is quite a tall order. But nevertheless, it's a pretty astounding thing to say, given how many times we've heard the Prime Minister commit to that date of March the 29th. Well, tonight, Downing Street said the position hadn't changed. The government was still committed to getting everything ready on time. But it's hard not to see this as some kind of signal that we won't be ready on time, that in fact, we will not be leaving on March the 29th.
Libby, thank you.
Now, you got yourselves into this mess. Now it's up to you to get yourselves out of it. That's the gist of Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar's message to Britain when we asked him if he was willing to compromise over the Ireland backstop, which is supposed to prevent the return of a hard border after Brexit. Mr Varadkar was at the Global Economic Summit in Davos alongside the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, is there too. Siobhan, what have you found out?
Well, Cathy, a few points really jump out at me from my interview with the Chancellor today. The first, that stark admission that the deal that will be put to Parliament next week won't contain anything new at all on the Irish backstop and will really be Plan A redux. And that leads to the second point, really, that there seems to be a repositioning going on here. The Chancellor telling me today that the supposed meaningful vote that will be put to Parliament next week isn't, in his words, the high noon, just part of the ongoing process. In other words, they clearly expect it to fail again. And lastly, this use of the buzzword compromise, something that everybody's very keen on, especially if somebody else is doing it. Here's how today played out. The last day of Davos and the last chance for the Chancellor here to clear the path to a smooth Brexit before the next crucial vote on Tuesday. In a flurry of activity, he cancelled an appearance, we're told, to hold a string of meetings with the Swiss, the Canadians, the French. But he knows the chances of reaching any compromise on the painful issue of the Irish backstop are still remote. Have you collectively been able to reach any movement on the backstop, any changes, any consensus that you can put to Parliament on Tuesday as part of this new vote?
No, I don't think we'll be ready to do that on Tuesday. There are definitely discussions going on within the European Union about this whole process and the red lines that the European Union's drawn around the backstop. So I think we're in an exploratory process at the moment, but it's clear that the backstop is the focus.
Why don't you just ask for an extension and give us more time, give yourselves more time?
Because it is the ticking clock that is focusing people's minds. And you can see that from comments that some of my colleagues have made. They are starting to think about the very stark choices that we would face as we approach that deadline. And it is that will drive people, both at home and in the EU, towards trying to find a workable compromise.
You hope?
I hope and I expect.
It was only last week that Philip Hammond was quietly reassuring business leaders that he'd do all he could to take no deal off the table. A week on, though, and maybe it's something in the alpine air, but his language has become much more pointed. Now it's the very threat of a no deal that he believes will bring all the disparate parties to the table and force the compromise needed to reach a deal. But just listen to the tone of the Irish Prime Minister. Prime Minister, can I get one quick question with you? Our Chancellor today has said, are you willing to compromise? The Chancellor today has said Europe has to compromise. Are you willing to compromise?
I think we should never forget that Brexit is a problem created by Britain, so the onus is on them to come up with solutions. They're the ones who've created this problem. We feel we've compromised a lot already. But
does that mean you won't compromise? Someone's got to compromise here.
I think the United Kingdom, if it changes its red lines, if it moves away from its red lines, then the European position can evolve too.
Have they come to you with a proposal yet?
Not yet, thank you.
Has Mr. Hammond spoken to you? Has Mr. Hammond spoken to you today?
Siobhan, thank you, that's enough.
Blocking tactics in Europe and at home, MPs in deadlock. Is it time for the Chancellor to accept a deal is beyond reach?
We have to do it. We have to do it. That is our absolute priority obligation.
What if you can't? What if you can't? You must think now, we might not be able to do this.
I invite you to look at every major political negotiation in history, and it is always the prospect of reaching the deadline that starts to focus people's minds on moving away from their preferred position towards an acceptable compromise that allows a deal to be done.
Would you resign if there was a no deal?
You're talking hypotheticals now. I am getting on.
It's hypothetical, it's 8 weeks away.
I am getting on with the job of forging a compromise solution that gives us a deal and allows us to leave the European Union in good order on March the 29th.
Compromise on the cliff edge, the high-stakes gamble from the Chancellor that could define the country's future. Whether the Queen would approve of pushing a deal to the wire, we don't know. But in a rare intervention, she urged people to find common ground and to respect different points of view. A lesson for Brexit, perhaps, but back in the rarefied Swiss air, despite a week of supposed Davos deal-making, the gulf between those different points of view still seems insurmountable. Well, that's the other point that really struck me today, is the repositioning also of Philip Hammond himself away from the plodding spreadsheet Phil, as he's sometimes known, into what some might see as the high-risk deal maker who's prepared to go right down to the wire and use the fear of a no deal to try and force an agreement. Now, that's not something that will make the business community that have been talking to him here in Davos this week very happy. They'd be looking to him to de-risk the situation. One chief executive tonight, quite angry, who didn't want to be named, said this to me: who is he playing poker with? The British people, the British Parliament, or the EU? Now, clearly there is still a lot of work to do, but for now, here from Davos for another year, that's it from me. Back to you.
Thanks, Siobhan. Now, ahead of next week's critical test for Theresa May's Brexit deal, ministers are again split, this time over the prospect of a no-deal scenario. Mrs May faces a series of votes on Tuesday, including calls for MPs to take control of the Brexit process from the government. Today, supporters of a second referendum have been rallying in Edinburgh. Let's go live to our Scotland correspondent, Kieran Jenkins. Kieran.
Well, it certainly is a big week ahead in Westminster, and a sense this weekend that politicians, particularly those that oppose a no deal, are getting particularly nervy, because remember, a no deal is a default position. That's what happens if nothing changes. Now, Scotland's Brexit Secretary, Mike Russell, was addressing a rally in Edinburgh today, calling for an extension of Article 50 and a second EU referendum, but he was also there telling us that the Scottish Government is ramping up its no-deal preparations, as indeed are governments throughout Europe. And what he said was that if there is a no-deal, the Scottish Government will demand emergency funding from the UK Treasury to deal with the fallout. I asked him if he now thought that a no-deal was the most likely scenario.
I think it is becoming increasingly likely. I won't say it's the most likely because we are still in a very fluid situation, but we are doing everything we can to prepare for it, but we can't do everything to prepare for it. I'm spending, I would say, well over half my time on it, so are many of my colleagues. The sheer cost of that is enormous. That's another reason why ruling out a no deal as quickly as possible is the right thing to do.
What is the cost of it? How much has the Scottish Government spent so far on no deal planning?
It's very difficult to quantify, but certainly I think we are talking in tens of millions presently.
We've heard today that some civil servants and government officials behind the scenes have likened this to the volcanic ash cloud or even war planning. Are those words that you would use?
Yeah, I was involved in a volcanic ash cloud incident. I was Education Secretary. We were trying to get teachers and pupils back. My view is it's considerably worse than that.
And just lay out for us why this is such a crucial week.
Well, this may finally be the week in which Parliament flexes its muscles and MPs begin to flesh out what they're actually for and not just what they're against. So on Tuesday, Theresa May goes back to the Commons to set out her next steps. There will be a series of amendments tabled, not yet selected by the Speaker, to try and force the government in one direction or another. So will we see an amendment passed instructing the government to stop no deal and extend Article 50 until 2019? That's the Labour MP Yvette Cooper's amendment. Could we see an amendment instructing Parliament to exert control of the process and hold a series of votes to see what MPs are for? Incidentally, David Gauke, the Justice Secretary, became the second cabinet member to break ranks and suggest that he wants to see MPs having a free vote to break the deadlock. Or will we see MPs pass an amendment calling for the Irish backstop there to prevent a hard border in Ireland, of course, to have an expiry date of 2021? And will the government try and encourage this in some way or use it as a means to go back to the EU and say this is what it will take to get Theresa May's deal through? By the way, the EU have sort of preemptively reiterated that the backstop only changes if Theresa May's red lines change. Krishna.
Thank you, Kieran. Well, joining me now from his Wiltshire constituency is the Conservative MP, Andrew Murison, who has tabled that amendment that Kieran was just talking about, which would put a time limit on this controversial Northern Ireland backstop. Andrew Murison, can you just be clear? Have you done this in coordination with Downing Street? Are you reaching out to the Eurosceptics and the ERG and the DUP on Theresa May's behalf?
I'm reaching out to everyone, and my amendment derives from a number of conversations I've had with all sorts of colleagues over the past several days. It seems to me the sticking point with this withdrawal agreement that fell so dramatically on the 15th of January revolves around this backstop aimed at dealing with the so-called hard border. If we can deal with this in a sensible way, then I think we've got the basis for a way forward, and that's the purpose of my amendment.
So you're hoping, if your amendment or one of the similar ones gets a big vote, Theresa May will be able to go to Brussels and say, look, this is what my MPs want. If you give us something on that, we'll get the deal through. That's the idea.
Yes, in essence,
yeah.
That's exactly what it is, because it's clear the withdrawal agreement as drafted is a dead duck.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble is that for 2 years, the European Union has been making absolutely clear that you can't time limit a backstop, otherwise it's not a backstop. You know, and Juncker again today has said, OK, you can get rid of the backstop, but if you want to do that, you have to have the customs union.
Yeah, but Christian, the point is we're getting ourselves out of an arrangement that had Article 50, in other words, the ability to remove ourselves from an international treaty, which is where we are right now, at the end of that process. It would be odd, wouldn't it, if we signed up to a new agreement, the withdrawal agreement, that potentially holds us in the customs union and establishes Northern Ireland as different from the rest of the United Kingdom indefinitely. That's the problem.
How many of those ERG rebels who voted against the Prime Minister's deal have told you that they will come in behind the Prime Minister?
I genuinely don't have a figure for you.
Right.
I don't have a figure for you, but all I can say is I think there's a softening of opinion on both sides of this great divide in our modern politics. Yeah. And I think there's a sense of pragmatism, and that's why I'm hopeful for the outcome on Tuesday.
I mean, the trouble is there is no sign of any softening in Europe. I mean, again, I have to put it to you that, both in Ireland and in Brussels, there is no sign of them giving way on this. And why would they? They can see what a mess that we're in. They can see MPs in Parliament moving to rule out no deal. You know, if you were a Brussels negotiator, you'd say, sit tight, they're the ones who are going to buckle.
No, if I was a Brussels negotiator, I want to get this over the line so that we can ensure that going forward, both the EU and the United Kingdom, and particularly the island of Ireland, gain some benefit from this, are not disadvantaged from this. And the way to do that is to get this agreement over the line with what I think are sensible amendments that I've suggested, that I think would carry the support of a great number of my colleagues from my conversations over the past few days. And if we can have some flexibility on that, which I think is only reasonable, given what the European Union is otherwise asking us to sign up to in terms of an indefinite contract, then I think we have the basis for an agreement. And that's what I'm trying to achieve on Tuesday.
After the expiry, you know, after your time limit has gone, what would happen? We would then have a no-deal Brexit and a hard border in Northern Ireland, wouldn't we?
Well, no, we would not, because it's very clear from the evidence my Select Committee has gathered, for example, that there are ways of dealing with this hard border other than through the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol in the withdrawal agreement. It has to do with technology and systems.
Ireland says that's magical thinking.
Well, Ireland may say that, but of course the European Parliament itself, in its own report of 2 years ago, said that it was entirely possible. So I think, you know, it's pretty clear to me, from the exhaustive evidence my Select Committee has taken, that there is a solution to this that relies on modern systems and technology.
What I'm saying is, you know, if Ireland doesn't agree to this, and Ireland doesn't agree to it, it's just a non-runner, isn't it? I mean, you know, last time, I mean, you did try and bring this vote to Parliament on the night of the meaningful vote. The Speaker didn't select it. If that happens again on Tuesday, what would you think?
Well, there are a number of similar amendments that have been drafted by me and my colleagues, and I think it would be a remarkable thing if Mr. Speaker Bercow did not select one of them. That would be truly remarkable.
Well, Andrew Morrison, thank you very much indeed.